They took pictures of our trash cans, then mailed us a fine for visual pollution. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, stamped with the city seal and signed by someone who'd never set foot in our neighborhood. Sarah Martinez held the envelope in her trembling hands, staring at the words that made no sense. $500. For putting out garbage on the wrong day. For containers that were supposedly aesthetically disruptive to community standards. But what they didn't know, what the faceless bureaucrats behind their mahogany desks couldn't possibly understand, was that this wasn't just about trash cans. This was about a woman who had spent every morning for 3 years wheeling her elderly neighbor's bins to the curb because he couldn't do it himself. This was about a community that looked out for each other in ways that couldn't be measured by city ordinances or photographed by code enforcement officers. This was about Maria Santos, the 87-year-old widow next door, who had watched Sarah's children grow up from her kitchen window and had become the grandmother they never had. And what none of them realized, not the inspector who took those pictures, not the supervisor who signed that fine, was that Sarah Martinez wasn't just any concerned neighbor. She was Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, recently returned from her 3rd deployment overseas, where she had coordinated humanitarian aid in villages that had been forgotten by their own governments, where she had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of service, bringing water to the thirsty, food to the hungry, or simply rolling trash bins for someone who couldn't, were what separated civilization from chaos. But in her suburban American neighborhood, those same acts of compassion were about to land her in court, labeled as a public nuisance by people who had never understood what it meant to serve. The inspector's car was already parked across the street when Sarah stepped out that morning, camera in hand, ready to document what he called repeat violations of Municipal Code 47.3b. He didn't see the Purple Heart medal sitting quietly on Sarah's kitchen table. He didn't know about the sleepless nights she spent listening for Maria's emergency button, or the grocery runs she made twice a week for a woman whose own family lived 3 states away. He just saw trash cans on the curb 2 hours early and a violation worth $500. But what he was about to discover was that some battles aren't fought with weapons or paperwork. Sometimes they're fought by communities who refuse to let bureaucracy crush the human spirit. Welcome to Heartland Tales. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? We share stories that matter, stories that remind us what it means to look out for each other in a world that sometimes forgets. If these stories touch your heart the way they touch ours, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe to support our channel. We're growing every day, and we sincerely thank you for being part of this community. The neighborhood had a rhythm that outsiders never quite understood. Maple Street was the kind of place where you waved when you saw someone in their yard, where conversations happened over fence lines, and where most people minded their own business. Sarah Martinez had moved there 18 months ago, seeking the quiet normalcy that military families dream about during deployment. The house was modest, a 2-story colonial with blue shutters that needed painting. Her children, Emma and James, had adapted quickly to civilian life, riding bikes on sidewalks and playing in unfenced yards. Next door lived Maria Santos, whose husband had passed away the winter before Sarah moved in. Maria's house was immaculate, yellow with white trim and flower boxes that bloomed every spring. But Maria herself had been fading gradually, the way people do when age and loneliness converge. That's how it started. Sarah saw Maria struggling to pull her wheeled bin one Thursday morning, pausing every few steps to catch her breath. Sarah had been halfway to her car when she stopped, turned around, and walked up Maria's driveway. "Let me help you with that," she'd said, and Maria looked up with grateful, embarrassed eyes. Soon it became routine, Sarah wheeling both bins to the curb every Thursday, a small ritual that neither woman mentioned but both counted on. The neighborhood watched this with quiet approval. Mrs. Peterson from across the street noticed. So did the Johnsons 2 houses down. Nobody talked about it directly, but there was a sense that something right was happening on Maple Street, something that made the whole block feel more like a community. But the city's code enforcement division didn't measure community spirit. They measured compliance. According to newly updated ordinances, trash bins could only be placed at the curb between 6 p.m. the night before collection and 6 a.m. the morning of collection. Not earlier. Not even if you were helping an elderly neighbor who couldn't manage it herself. The first notice had been a warning, yellow paper tucked under Sarah's windshield with a reminder about proper waste management protocols. She'd adjusted her routine, getting up even earlier to handle the task before the deadline. But Maria sometimes forgot which day was trash day, putting her bins out whenever she remembered, often Tuesday or Wednesday. The second notice came with a photograph attached, 2 green bins at the curb, time-stamped at 4:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. $50. The third notice brought a $100 fine and court action threats. The fourth warned of property liens. Now, holding this latest letter with its $500 penalty and mandatory court appearance, Sarah realized her act of kindness had escalated into a legal battle. But Sarah Martinez had faced bigger battles. She'd coordinated supply drops in hostile territory, managed refugee camps where clean water was luxury, and led teams whose lives depended on her problem-solving abilities. A trash bin ordinance wasn't going to stop her from taking care of Maria Santos. The courtroom was smaller than expected, with buzzing fluorescent lights and wooden benches from the 1970s. Sarah wore her best civilian clothes, a navy blue dress her mother had bought for job interviews, but felt more comfortable in combat boots. This wasn't her terrain. This was a world of procedures designed to confuse rather than clarify. The docket was full that morning, violations that painted a picture of a city more concerned with compliance than compassion. A man fined for working on his car in his driveway. A woman cited for toys in her front yard. An elderly gentleman penalized for grass a quarter-inch too long. Sarah watched with growing disbelief, realizing good intentions could be criminalized if they didn't fit municipal definitions. When her name was called, she approached the defendant's table with military bearing. The prosecutor outlined charges without looking up: repeated violations of Ordinance 47.3b, failure to comply despite warnings, disregard for community aesthetic standards. Each phrase sounded more ridiculous than the last. The prosecutor presented evidence methodically, time-stamped photographs showing bins outside allowable hours, documentation of ignored warnings, statements describing Sarah as uncooperative and dismissive. The picture painted was of a stubborn resident who thought rules didn't apply to her. When asked to plead, Sarah stood and said simply, "Not guilty, Your Honor." She didn't elaborate, didn't explain circumstances, didn't mention Maria. Her training taught her there was a time for explanation and a time for action, and this courtroom seemed more interested in procedure than human stories. The judge scheduled trial for 6 weeks later. As Sarah gathered her papers, she noticed a woman in the back who had been watching with unusual intensity. Older, probably 60s, with silver hair and eyes that cataloged everything. She wore a simple black suit that spoke authority without ostentation, moving with purposeful grace that comes from years of command. Outside, the woman approached Sarah directly. "Excuse me. I'm Judge Catherine Walsh, retired. I was observing today for a report on municipal court procedures, but your case caught my attention." She studied Sarah's face. "Would you be willing to talk? I have a feeling there's more to this story." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "I don't want trouble. I just want to help my neighbor." Judge Walsh smiled. "Help your neighbor. That's exactly what I thought this might be about. Would you show me? I'd like to meet this neighbor. I have a feeling this case is about to become much more complicated than anyone realizes." The walk to Maple Street gave Sarah time to study her companion. Judge Walsh asked questions like someone who genuinely wanted understanding. About Sarah's children, the neighborhood, what made her help with Maria's bins. Her questions weren't intrusive, but thorough. "I was deployed 3 times, Sarah found herself explaining. Afghanistan twice, Iraq once. In those places, you learn communities survive when people look out for each other. When someone needs help, you help them. It's not complicated." She paused, looking at the neat houses. "When I came back, I thought civilian life would be simpler. Sometimes it feels more complicated than anything overseas." At Maria's house, Judge Walsh paused to admire the flower boxes before knocking. Maria answered cautiously but brightened seeing Sarah. "Mija," she said, using the endearment that had evolved naturally. "I wasn't expecting you so early." Maria invited them for coffee with genuine warmth, and Judge Walsh accepted graciously. In Maria's living room, surrounded by photographs of distant children and grandchildren, Maria told her story without prompting. She talked about her husband of 53 years, about the garden they'd maintained together, about how the neighborhood had changed from a place where everyone knew everyone to simple coexistence. She talked about phone calls from Phoenix, business trips to Atlanta, grandchildren who sent drawings in the mail. She talked about the morning Sarah had appeared to help with bins, and how that gesture had led to conversations, shared dinners, and a friendship that made the difference between loneliness and community. "She doesn't have to help me," Maria said, looking at Sarah with decades of gratitude. "She has her own life, children, troubles. But every Thursday morning, she's there. Even when it's raining. Even when those city people started causing problems." Her voice carried surprising anger. "They don't understand what it means to be old, to need help but not want to ask. They just see rules that aren't being followed." Judge Walsh listened with the attention that had made her successful for 20 years. She asked gentle questions about trash timing, Maria's mobility, the city's communication about ordinance changes. But she never suggested Maria should manage her own bins or Sarah should stop helping. She understood this was about more than waste management. When they left an hour later, Judge Walsh was quiet. Finally, approaching Sarah's driveway, she spoke. "I've been on the bench for 23 years. I've seen thousands of cases, everything from traffic violations to constitutional questions. But I've never seen someone prosecuted for being a good neighbor." She looked back toward Maria's yellow house. "I think it's time the city learned about the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law." Over the following weeks, Sarah noticed changes. Her mail included more official envelopes. Not citations, but interview requests from reporters, invitations to speak at community meetings, letters from neighbors expressing support. The story somehow reached the local newspaper. The article was respectful, describing a veteran fined for helping an elderly neighbor. It mentioned her military service without sensationalizing. Reader response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters to the editor flooded in, expressing outrage that the city was prosecuting kindness. The story spread to regional news, national wire services, social media platforms with viral intensity. Sarah found herself reluctantly famous for something she'd never intended to be noticed for, uncomfortable with attention she hadn't sought. But attention brought unexpected allies. Veterans organizations offered legal support. Neighborhood associations shared similar stories about ordinances prioritizing compliance over community. Municipal court judges reached out privately, expressing concerns about law enforcement direction. Judge Walsh had been researching beyond courtroom observation. She'd obtained copies of city ordinances, enforcement patterns, violation statistics. What she found disturbed her enough to make calls to former colleagues, current officials, legal scholars specializing in municipal law. "The problem isn't just your case," she explained to Sarah over coffee. "It's the pattern your case represents. Cities nationwide are using code enforcement as revenue generation, targeting behaviors that would have been considered neighborly just a generation ago." She pulled out a thick folder. Fines for overgrown grass have increased 300% in 5 years. Citations for aesthetic violations are up 250%. But crime rates haven't changed. What's changed is budget pressure and willingness to criminalize ordinary life. Sarah studied the papers with intelligence briefing attention. Patterns were clear once you knew how to look. Low-income neighborhoods cited at higher rates than affluent areas. Elderly residents fined for maintenance issues reflecting physical limitations rather than neglect. Families penalized for visible toys or sports equipment. In almost every case, fines increased dramatically with violations, creating systems where single mistakes could escalate into significant financial burdens. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked. Judge Walsh smiled with purpose. "We fight it. Not just your case. The whole system. Because what's happening to you is happening to people all over this city, and most don't have resources or public attention to fight back effectively." She leaned forward with courtroom authority. "I think it's time to remind the city that laws are supposed to serve people, not the other way around." Trial day approached with unexpected intensity. What started as simple municipal violation had evolved into something much larger. The courtroom would be full, media present, community groups organized for support, city officials making press statements about uniform enforcement importance. But Sarah wasn't thinking about any of that, standing in her bedroom looking at 2 outfits on her bed. One was the navy dress from her arraignment, conservative and respectful, designed to help her blend into civilian legal systems. The other was her dress uniform, worn for formal military occasions, complete with ribbons representing deployments, commendations, service record. She'd been debating this choice for weeks, since Judge Walsh suggested sometimes the most powerful argument was simply showing people who you really were. The uniform would send a message, but Sarah wasn't sure what that message would be. She didn't want to seem like someone using military service for special treatment, but pretending to be just another suburban mom wasn't serving truth either. Maria made the decision, arriving early with homemade cookies and determined expression. "Mija," she said, settling at Sarah's kitchen table with earned authority. "Today you fight for what's right. You should wear clothes that show who you are." Sarah realized Maria was right. The uniform wasn't about special treatment. It was about honoring service that taught her to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. It represented not just her own case, but all the other cases without media attention, public support, retired judges understanding the difference between justice and bureaucracy. When Sarah walked into the courtroom wearing dress uniform with precisely aligned ribbons and military posture, the room fell silent. She took her seat with the same calm confidence she'd brought to every difficult military situation, prepared to fight a battle about much more than trash bins and ordinance violations. The prosecutor began with the same methodical approach, but something was different. The photographs seemed less compelling when viewing a uniformed veteran who had clearly dedicated her life to service. Documentation of violations read more like evidence of persistent compassion than stubborn defiance. When he described Sarah as uncooperative and dismissive, several gallery members shifted uncomfortably, as if words didn't match the person they were seeing. For the defense, Sarah's court-appointed attorney was joined by Judge Walsh, granted special permission as expert witness on municipal law. Her testimony was methodical and devastating, walking through ordinance history, enforcement patterns, community impact. She presented data showing selective prosecution, revenue generation enforcement, city policies creating situations where neighborly kindness could be criminalized. The most powerful moment came when Judge Walsh called Maria Santos to testify. The elderly woman walked to the witness stand with careful dignity, wearing her best dress, carrying herself with the pride of someone who had raised children, buried a husband, survived decades of neighborhood changes. Her testimony was simple and direct, explaining physical limitations, gratitude for Sarah's help, confusion about punishing kindness. "In my country," Maria said, accent more pronounced in formal setting, "we have a saying, el que no vive para servir, no serve para vivir." It means, those who don't live to serve others are not fit to live. This young woman lives to serve. She served her country, now she serves her neighbors. Why would you punish someone for living the right way? The prosecutor had no questions for Maria. The judge sat quietly after her testimony, looking out at a courtroom including reporters, veterans, neighbors, city officials seeing the case from new perspective. When he spoke, his voice carried weight, suggesting he understood his decision's implications would extend far beyond this single case. This court has heard testimony about ordinances and enforcement, community standards, and individual responsibility, the balance between rules and compassion. He began, looking directly at Sarah. But at its heart, this case is about what kind of community we want to live in, and what kind of behavior we want to encourage or discourage through our legal system. He paused, consulting notes, but clearly speaking from conviction rather than precedent. The defendant stands before this court as someone who has served her country with distinction and continues to serve her community with the same dedication. The prosecution has proven she violated a municipal ordinance, but they have not proven this violation caused any harm to her community or anyone in it. In fact, evidence suggests quite the opposite. The judge's voice grew stronger. Laws exist to serve people, not the other way around. When law enforcement begins to criminalize acts of kindness, to punish neighborly behavior, to discourage the exact community spirit that makes neighborhoods stronger and safer, then perhaps we need to examine not just the individual case before us, but the system that created this situation. He looked around the courtroom, taking in media representatives, city officials, community members who had witnessed what had become much more than simple municipal violation hearing. This court finds the defendant not guilty of the charges against her, not because she didn't violate the technical requirements of the ordinance, but because the enforcement of this ordinance in these circumstances serves no legitimate public interest and contradicts the community values that our laws should be designed to protect. The gavel came down with finality that seemed to echo beyond courthouse walls. Sarah stood and shook hands with her attorney, Judge Walsh, finally with the prosecutor, who offered quiet apology for a case he'd never wanted to bring. As she turned to leave, she saw Maria Santos in the front row, tears streaming, applauding with joy that comes from seeing justice done in a world that doesn't always remember what justice looks like. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered for statements and photographs, but Sarah found herself thinking about the quiet morning routine that had started this whole situation. Tomorrow was Thursday. Maria's bins would need to go to the curb, and Sarah would be there to help, just as she had been every week for 3 years, because some things were more important than ordinances or fines or court cases. Judge Walsh approached as the crowd dispersed, carrying a different folder. "I have something for you," she said, handing Sarah an official certificate. "It's a commendation from the Veterans Legal Aid Society. They wanted to recognize your service, both military and civilian. But more than that, they wanted to use your case as foundation for a new legal clinic that will help veterans and community members navigate situations like this one." Sarah looked at the certificate, then at the retired judge who had become an unexpected ally. "I just wanted to help my neighbor," she said. "I know," Judge Walsh replied. "That's exactly what made this case worth fighting for. Because in a world where helping your neighbor can get you arrested, someone needs to stand up and remind the system what really matters." She paused, looking back at the courthouse where they'd witnessed something rare. Victory for common sense over bureaucracy, for community over compliance, for human spirit over municipal code. Walking home that afternoon, still wearing her dress uniform but feeling more relaxed than she had in months, Sarah noticed things about her neighborhood she'd been too stressed to appreciate. Mrs. Peterson waved from her garden. The Johnsons' children ran over to congratulate her. The young couple with the baby stopped to say thank you, explaining. They'd been worried about their own minor violations until they'd seen how the community rallied around her case. The most meaningful moment came at Maria's house, finding the elderly woman sitting on her front porch, waiting with patient contentment. They didn't talk about the trial or media attention or legal implications. They talked about dinner plans and Maria's grandchildren and weekend weather. They talked about ordinary things, daily details of community life that had been at the heart of this case from the beginning. As the sun set over Maple Street, Sarah realized she'd learned something important about the difference between serving your country and serving your community. Military service taught her about duty and honor on a grand scale, but civilian life taught her that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons or strategies, but with simple persistence in doing what was right, even when the system made it difficult. That evening, helping Emma and James with homework and listening to their school stories, Sarah thought about the question raised in court. What kind of community do we want to live in? For her, the answer was simple. She wanted to live in a community where helping your neighbor was not just legal, but expected, where veterans could transition to civilian service that honored their training and values, where elderly people like Maria Santos were supported by neighbors understanding that community meant looking out for each other. The legal victory was important, but it was also just the beginning. Judge Walsh's legal clinic would help other people facing similar situations, and media attention sparked conversations about municipal code enforcement in city councils across the region. But for Sarah Martinez, the real victory would be measured in smaller terms. Continuation of Thursday morning trash bin duty, the security Maria felt knowing someone was looking out for her, and the example she was setting for her children about what it meant to be a good neighbor. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons or in foreign countries. Sometimes they're fought in municipal courtrooms, over issues that seem small but represent something much larger. Sometimes they're fought by veterans who understand that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform, and sometimes they're won by communities that remember what it means to take care of each other. Sarah Martinez didn't set out to become a symbol or challenge a system or fight a legal battle covered by national media. She just wanted to help her elderly neighbor get trash bins to the curb every Thursday morning. But in a world where bureaucracy sometimes threatens to overwhelm humanity, where rules can criminalize kindness, and where communities are measured by compliance rather than compassion, sometimes the smallest acts of service become the most important acts of resistance. The lesson isn't that all laws are wrong or enforcement is misguided. The lesson is that laws should serve people, not the other way around. That enforcement should strengthen communities, not tear them apart. And when the system loses sight of its purpose, it takes ordinary people doing extraordinary things to remind everyone what really matters. In the end, Sarah Martinez won more than a court case. She won the right to continue being a good neighbor, and she reminded an entire city what good neighbors look like. She proved that military service is foundation for civilian service, not a separate chapter that ends when you come home. And she demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful uniform you can wear represents not your past service, but your ongoing commitment to serve others, even when no one is watching, even when it's not convenient, and even when the system tries to stop you. This story was brought to you by Heartland Tales. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who served quietly, helped consistently, and made their community stronger just by being the kind of person who shows up when others need them? Tell us in the comments about the everyday heroes in your life, the neighbors who've made a difference, the veterans who continue to serve long after their military careers have ended. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, if you believe that communities are strengthened when we celebrate acts of kindness instead of criminalizing them, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and we sincerely thank you for being part of a community that values service, compassion, and the kind of neighborly love that makes the world a better place, one trash bin at a time.